Shanghai GDG is a very interesting developer community.
I'm glad somebody has asked this question.
This is where the magic happens.
This is primarily a question and answer show. So if any of you out there would like to ask questions.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our Make the Web Fast episode here on Google Developers Live. Today we have an exciting episode about web fonts and Google Web Fonts. But before we get to that, my name is Ilya Grigorik, and I'm a developer advocate for the Make the Web Fast team.
And hello, I'm David Kutel, an engineer from the Google Web Fonts team.
Awesome. So, David, as I was reflecting on the title of this episode, I said, making pretty fast. And I think in retrospect, I actually kind of created a false dichotomy, right? Because it almost kind of gives a message of it's one or the other, right? It's like if you make it pretty, you can't make it fast. And I think as we were working through kind of the material that we're going to cover, certainly one thing that I realized is that's definitely not true anymore. In fact, there are many cases where you can use web fonts to make your site perform faster and perform really, really well.
Absolutely, and we're really eager to get the message out.
Yeah, exactly. So you guys are doing a lot of exciting stuff, and we're going to go pretty deep today on formats, how the data served, and many other questions, right? So I often get questions about web fonts, so I think this is very important. So let's share the screen here. And I think the first message that both of us agree on, and I hesitate to call myself a designer, but in the past I've actually done a little bit of web design. And one of the things I've learned is that typography is probably the best tool that you have at your disposal to make something pretty, right? It's that idea of simple and elegant, and you can do a lot with just a simple web font, right? And unfortunately, web fonts in general have not been very accessible historically for a long time to us. So on the web, most of the content is actually text. So having access to fonts and being able to do a great job of presenting that content is very, very important, right?
Absolutely.
So because we had these problems with web fonts historically, developers are an innovative bunch. So we worked out kind of solutions, interim solutions. And one of those was, well, let's take our text, let's use the font that we want, and then put it as an image on our web pages, right? And that actually has a lot of downsides, as we will talk about. But historically, that's actually been probably the most prevalent way to get fonts on a page, right? This is probably from like 2000 to 2007. That is actually the only real way for you to get fonts on a page, which is frankly not very good for a number of reasons, performance included. So I think because of that, there was a lot of companies that came to be, and I'm curious to learn a little bit about the history about Google Web Fonts. How did you guys get started?
Sure. Well, it's fascinating. The project started over 5 years ago when we were attempting to get more fonts into Google Docs. We learned a lot along the way. At first, it looked like it was going to be really straightforward. We tried them in Firefox. They just worked. We thought, wow, that's very simple, very easy. How hard could it be? But then when we tried to get them working across all browsers, platforms, we realized that there's actually a lot of complexity. And it was something that we were very excited to make easier. So to back up and answer your question, like, are web fonts a future technology, or are they real? Are they going mainstream today?
Right.
And we have some numbers. So we launched in 2010. We've topped over 1 billion font views in a day.
Wow.
And we're on the verge of serving that on a regular basis. Google Web Fonts are being used on over 10 million integrations and well over 100 million web pages.
Right.
We've made over 521 web fonts available. They're all open source, free to use, and we have a very simple and straightforward
Right,
API.
so 521 font families. I think that's more than what I have installed in my system. Right, so it's a very deep library already.
That's very true. Yeah, in the past, developers have been limited to the set of web-safe fonts, which
right.
has been a set of 4. And so you're absolutely correct. This is a huge improvement.
Right, and it sounds like there's a lot of other companies working in the space as well, right? So does Google Web Fonts work with any other companies, or what is the difference maybe between some of the alternatives?
Absolutely. Well, what's really exciting is there's so much innovation in the space today, from different business models to better tools, making more fonts available, improved rendering, everything. We've been very fortunate to have the opportunity to work with all of the major web font services. We've worked with Typekit, Fonts.com, Extensis, etc. And we all want to accelerate the adoption of web fonts and improve the technologies together.
Right.
I also have a few other key points that I wanted to get across. So for Google, why web fonts? Why would we care? The way I think about it is the web is core to Google. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
And fonts are core to the web. And so we see web fonts as a really exciting technology that we could use to improve all our products, from search, where websites that use web fonts are easier to index, to display ads, where they could become richer, interactive, work better on mobile, to apps, to devices, you name it. And in addition to that, we really want to help move the entire web forward.
Right. So I think that aligns really well with a lot of the other efforts like CSS3 and others, where we are putting a lot of effort into enabling kind of developers and designers to build rich experiences, right? So the kind of thing that you would have maybe in a magazine before, with a beautiful layout and selectable text, and all of these things come together, right? So let me actually, I think a lot of people have used Google Web Fonts before, but I just want to show a quick demo of what does this actually feel like, right? So I have Google Web Fonts here open, so we have 521 families. And I think you guys just recently added this new poster view, which I actually love, because it's a very nice visual way to get the look of the font.
Great. And Ilya, I'm going to time you. Can we do this in 30 seconds or less? So go.
Sure. Okay, so I'll pick the first font here, right? Quick use. And so, a couple of options. For this font, there are actually two different weights, so normal and bold, so I can select each one. There is Latin 1 or Latin Extended for the character sets, which I think we'll talk about. And then I just copy this link right here, right? And
Absolutely.
I think that's all I need. So I actually have an example. So I have a JS bin file here, which if you guys haven't used before, it's a very awesome tool. On the left here, I have just a sample page, and anytime I modify something in here, it just updates the preview on the right? So it's just a very quick visual way. So I can paste in some text in here, and it'll include the font, right? So I've kind of prepared a few things earlier, so let me just uncomment this. Whoops, that's not what we wanted. Let's go back. So we'll just uncomment this font family here. And I've created a couple of different rules, right? So this is just completely unstyled page. And what I'm going to do now is just, for example, style the H1. And all of a sudden, you can see a much nicer looking page coming out on the other end. So, right, so just 5 lines, and this page looks dramatically different.
Yeah, how easy is that?
Right, exactly. So let's go back. I actually want to ask you a few questions on this page, right? Because I think we kind of breezed right by it. So
we did.
First of all, this dial right here is very interesting to me, right? Because it references page load. And anytime I notice that when I add a new font, the number goes up, and it kind of tells me that I don't want to be in a red zone. So what does this actually mean?
Yeah, so more than anything, we wanted to just convey the message that web fonts do lead to an additional download. And so it's something to think about and something to be conscious of. Of course, it all depends. So if your site leverages a lot of images, you're very likely to not even notice the extra download. But if it is just a simple HTML page, the font could end up being the majority of the download time.
Right.
And so the indicator is more of an approximation. It's a range. It's not an exact number, for the reason being that we have a lot of very platform-specific optimizations.
Right.
So for example, we serve up smaller files to Mac, larger files to Windows.
Yeah, that's a very good
point. So it's
point.
more just an indicator.
Right. So and we'll talk about that later in more detail.
Definitely.
Right? But I guess the broad message here is the more fonts you include, the more data you will have to download. So if at all possible, it makes sense to omit things you may not use, right? Because I know that I've been guilty of this, where I've come here and in the early stages of my design, I would say, well, yeah, I probably need the italic version and the extra bold version and these 5 versions, and just include them all, and then I leave them there, and I'm actually not using them.
Right.
So that's a gotcha. Then there's the character set. So this is for different languages?
That is correct.
Okay. So different fonts will also have different support for different languages.
That is correct. Our goal is to expand coverage over time, but for most of the fonts, there's largely just Latin coverage today.
Right. Okay. And then this last bit here, I think is very interesting to me. So by default, you guys give me the link tag to a CSS file, which I can then include in my page, right?
Correct.
But there's 2 other options. So there's the import statement, which is also something that I can copy and paste into my CSS file.
Correct.
And a JavaScript way. So why would I prefer one or the other?
Well, so for the first 2, we would recommend that you be consistent with other resources on your website. So if you're using style sheet links, just continue using style sheet links. If you've been using @imports throughout the CSS, just continue using that. There are some performance trade-offs that are good to be aware of, and Steve Soders has an excellent write-up on it.
Right, yeah.
Regarding JavaScript, however, this is more of an advanced feature where you, as the developer, can sort of take control over the web font loading experience and really fine-tune it.
Right, so I think I looked at the at the documentation earlier, and it gave me kind of a series of callbacks to say the font is loading, the font is active, so I can define different behaviors in that case.
Yes. And basically, you can do really advanced things. So you can specify. You could completely control the behavior. You could have the text fade in once the font becomes available.
Right.
You could always flash unstyled text. You could never flash unstyled text.
Right. Okay. So interesting. You just mentioned an interesting term there. So unstyled text, right? So I think in the web font community, this is fairly well understood, but I think it's worth spending a few minutes on this. So the problem in general is, as with any CSS or presentation format, if we show the unstyled content before the CSS is applied, and then we apply it after the fact, the user may actually see kind of a jarring experience where the page may completely relay out at a certain point, and maybe even shift and change in look and feel. So in general, browsers try to avoid this, and we defer displaying the content until we have all the necessary information, right? So that's what you're referring to here. And it sounds like with the JavaScript loader, I could actually define my own behaviors.
That is correct.
Right. So if you're really performance conscious, maybe that's something that you could look into.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay. So that's good. And we'll actually come back to the import statement, because I think this has some gotchas. A lot of people today use build steps in their infrastructure where they will, for example, concatenate multiple CSS files together, and they'll even inline import rules into the file, but that could actually cause problems, right? Because if you inline the wrong file format, as we will see, you may actually break some of the web fonts.
That is correct.
Right. So some stuff to be careful about. So let's go back to our presentation here. So we did the 30-second demo and some backup slides here. So web fonts are really exciting, right? I wanted to show a few demos. Before we get to the meaty technical part, I want to motivate, why do we care, right? Because I think there are obvious use cases like I want to make my pages pretty, but there are some other use cases which are not immediately obvious and are very, very important. So let's go back here. And the first one that you shared with me, which I think is awesome, is the Web Font Awards site, which contains a lot of very good demo sites using or leveraging web fonts, right? So if you go into the gallery, we're not going to go through it here, but if you guys are curious, I encourage you to check out webfontawards.com. Many different sites, great demos for the kinds of things you can do with web fonts.
And many of these are actually real-life sites.
Exactly.
So they're interesting demos for us, but real-life sites.
So I was actually on it earlier, and I picked out a couple, right? So for example, Bay State College.
Very nice.
All of the stuff here, so very clean, very simple, right? But all of the stuff is text, it's selectable, it's easy to read. I think it was very, very well done.
Great choice.
Another example, believe it or not, this is all selectable text. So he's just using web fonts for this stuff. And it's kind of got this grunge feel and look. I think until very recently, this would all have to be images.
That is correct. That is
right?
correct.
So I think this is another awesome demo. And then this example, I just stumbled on this. So this is a developer called Chad Mazzala. He's actually demoing what you can accomplish with Google Web Fonts. So this is something that you can use on your own site. So he just put together a couple of different styles, different looks. So for example, here's kind of your 2-column paper format, right? A nice quote using Google Web Fonts. Another font for kind of a newer look. And you kind of get a sense for the things that you can do. This example I love, right? It's kind of it's got a feel of that older book, and this is using nothing but web fonts and just some CSS markup to make it happen. So lots of very cool examples for what you can do with web fonts. So let's go back. Another example that I want to show you, because I really love this example, is Sean McBride. So he's actually an engineer on the Typekit team, and he was actually an ex-Googler too. And he put together this, he's given actually a couple of different presentations on how you can combine CSS3 and web fonts to make really awesome effects. And the one that I love is this hand-painted sign. So this to me looks like an image.
Oh, surely that's an image, right?
Except that it's not. It's selectable text. So what he's doing here is he has just regular text. He's using CSS transforms to get that kind of
the rotation.
The rotation. He's using drop shadows. He has a border. He's applying kind of a texture on top to make it look like it's painted on top. And all of this stuff is just text, right? And in fact, here's kind of a quick and an awesome tip. There's a great extension for Google Chrome called WhatFont, right? So what you do is, I have it enabled here. You can just click on it, and then you can hover over any piece of text on your page and just click on it, and it'll tell you what is the font being used and by whom it's being served. So in this case, we can see that the font is being served by Typekit, and the name of the font is Corner Store, right? And then for this text right here, it's actually a different font. It's called Bellow Caps, also served by Typekit. So if you're ever on a page that has beautiful typography, it's a very handy extension to just kind of click and view. Of course, you could also kind of dive deep into the CSS and figure out what's happening, but this is much easier. So I love this example. The first time he showed it to me, I was blown away, and I still, every time I look at it, I'm like, I can't believe that's actually the case. So nonetheless, that's also more of a design use case, right? Another case that I came across as I was researching this, which is very important, is Wikipedia is actually using web fonts to enable better cross-language support or multi-language support on their sites. So the problem being, for example, let me go to the site here. I'm loading this Wikipedia page, and this is not the actual language, right? There's no language with blocks. It's just that Chrome can't render this because Chrome doesn't have the right, it doesn't support this encoding format, right? So to enable this, I would have to go into system settings, install some font pack or language pack. I'm not even sure what I need to do, to be honest.
And that's not always an option on devices like the Chromebook, your tablets.
Yeah, so if I'm using some public terminal, I may not have access to install this kind of thing. So what Wikipedia is doing is they're actually leveraging web fonts. They're just, I think, starting to do this. So I think they have it for about 30 languages. This is not one of them, obviously, but what they're doing is they're pulling down the web font with the proper characters or proper glyphs such that you don't have to install anything. It just downloads into your browser and it's available immediately, which I think is a very, very cool use case.
Absolutely. And they've also scoped the opportunity, and I think they're targeting bringing the next 1 billion users online.
Right.
So it's, there are quite a few users that will benefit from this.
Right. So multi-language support is actually a very, very important use case. And then another one that emerged recently, I think, is icon fonts. Right. So I believe Google Web Fonts doesn't actually serve any icon fonts.
That is correct.
But there are good reasons to use icon fonts. So for example, one of the techniques that's very popular is spriting, where you take a lot of small images. So downloading small images, many of them, is very expensive because it requires a lot of connections. So generally, we recommend that you combine small images into a larger image that is then, using CSS positioning, you can put on a page. What icon fonts do is, instead of downloading that PNG or some other image format with all of the images, you download one web font, and then the icons themselves are basically characters, right? And the benefit you get out of that is that fonts are vector formats. So they're, for example, all of these icons here cycling through are just scaled up versions of that vector. So they're friendly for retina screens. You can zoom them in, you can zoom them out. They always look beautiful, right? Which you can't say of images, right? So very good reuse, and it's actually very efficient for this kind of stuff. So Font Awesome, which is an awesome name.
Which is absolutely correctly named.
Right, and there's many of these where you can actually customize them and build your own fonts. You know, I think this font has 200 plus icons, which is crazy. I probably don't need all of those, so you can actually customize it yourself. Okay, so let's take a step back, right? I think we talked about Google Web Fonts, we talked about how you can use it, but before we dive into the tech, let's look at the history. And the first point I'll make is that fonts have been with us since the beginning of the web, right? We actually had a font tag in the early HTML versions. And if you guys remember GeoCities, you know, we saw a lot of Comic Sans and a lot of images too, because people were trying to put different fonts that platforms did not have on the web, right? So that by itself was proof that, you know, fonts have been there all along. However, there's been a number of issues with using fonts, platform fonts. So first of all, the font tag is now deprecated, right? Ever since the CSS specification came along, because fonts are more of a presentation, right, format, they've been moved into CSS such that they support the same functionality, but it's the same problem. And the problem is that depending on which platform you're using, you will have, as you mentioned, system fonts on your system. So that may be, let's say, Arial and Verdana and a few others on, let's say, a Windows machine, right? And a Unix or a Linux, let's say Ubuntu, may not have all those fonts, right? Or historically may not have had all those fonts. So if you were assuming that the user had Comic Sans, you know, they may have gotten a completely different experience if they came on a different platform, right? So because of that, you were limited to, I think you said 4 web fonts?
Well, even less these days. So tablets, like the Android tablets,
right,
only come with one. Same for Google TV. Chrome OS has even fewer.
Just one? Wow.
For the Android tablets and Google TV, Chrome
Right.
OS, I believe, has 3 or so.
Okay, so there, if you want to have a different look and feel, you really have to use web fonts.
Absolutely.
Right. So, you know, you can't rely on system fonts, and the CSS spec does not address any of this, right? It was just kind of moved it from the font tag into CSS. But what I think a lot of people don't realize is that web fonts have actually existed. Technically, they've existed for a long time. Maybe we couldn't have used them for a long time, but back in 1997, both Netscape and Microsoft added web font support into their browsers. So as far back as IE4. It just seems that historically they didn't, for some reason, get much adoption back in 1997.
And there are reasons, and we'll talk about that.
Right, okay. Yeah, and then in 1999, we had even the W3C web font specification, right? But it seems like it took until 2007 to get anything off the ground. And in the meantime, I think we've, as we talked about earlier, we had to come up with some solutions, right? So I think a lot of the web has migrated towards using images, which is not a very good solution, which involved either doing manual encoding, if you will, right? So putting it into Photoshop and then kind of cropping it and putting it on your site. Or if you were doing a lot of these, you could actually use server-side plugins. So for example, I was a WordPress user for a long time, and I remember seeing a couple of plugins where, for example, PHP would render the image on the fly using the graphics library. But to be honest, I remember spending a day trying to configure it, and I failed, and I gave up on it. Right? So it was complicated, right? Like you needed a lot of dependencies, all that kind of stuff. And then around 2005, another technique came along, which was Flash replacement, which is the one I ended up using on my site, and a lot of people gave me grief about it for a long time. But the idea there was that you would have your regular text, and then you have kind of a combination of JavaScript and Flash, where once the page loads, the JavaScript would swap out the text with a Flash movie, and the Flash movie had the embedded font, which is crazy when you think about it, but it worked.
It did, and it was an improvement, but we still could do so much better.
Right, right. So let's talk about some problems with these approaches, right? And there's a lot of knots here. So I figured we're actually better off just looking at a real example. So I have the CSS Zen Garden site, right? And we're not trying to pick on CSS Zen Garden. I think many sites are kind of have the same characteristics.
No, rather, we're trying to show that this was state of the art just 2 years ago.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it's how you would create a beautiful site on the web.
Right. So here we have the site, right? And the first problem that I'll highlight is I have the web developer extension here. So if, let me see, there we go. So I'll just disable images. So I'll hide all of the images on the page, just so we can see how this page will look, right? So make images invisible. And let's look at this page now. So all of a sudden, a lot of the content has disappeared, which is actually how, let's say if I'm a crawler, right? So if I'm Google search or somebody else, this is what I get, right? So all of a sudden the headers are missing, the paragraph that describes the site is missing, all of this content is gone.
And a lot of the elements that disappeared were actually the most elements on the page. You know, your headings, your title.
Exactly. So if I'm if I'm writing a new blog post or authoring an article, I probably want the title of the article to be searchable, right? And unfortunately, that's gone. Now you could probably use alt tags on some of those images, but nonetheless, right? So if you're using a screen reader, it's still not a great experience.
Mm-hmm. And even with alt tags, a lot of information is lost, like size, emphasis.
Right. Exactly. So that's kind of problem number one. The other problem is, of course, if I zoom in, and this is especially a problem now with Retina screens and other things, right, where you can see as I'm zooming in, the quality of this page is not very good, right? The quality of the image just degrades. Whereas the text looks fine because that's actual font.
Exactly. And it's worth calling out that in order to have the image appear sharp on the newer high-resolution displays like Retinas, you'd actually need to serve up an image that could be twice as large.
Right.
So your page would become slower just to support newer devices.
Right. Whereas if I was using a vector format, I would just press zoom in and there'd be no extra requests.
Yes. And zooming in is a major use case on tablets today.
Right.
Pretty much the first thing I do. Maybe I'm going old, but
right.
I appreciate
you're always
larger text.
Pinching and zooming and scrolling and trying to figure out what you're trying to do. Yeah.
Yes.
So that's a very good point. And then the other case is translations, right? So I actually have the Google Translate extension here, and what I'm going to do is I'll translate this into, let's say, Korean. And look at that. The content is translated. Everything looks good, except that all of the titles are still in English, right? So it's the same problem that we saw earlier, but it just highlights the problem once again.
Absolutely. It's a major fail. And this is a use case that's only going to become increasingly common going forward.
Right.
My aunt, for example, English isn't her first language. And so she configured Chrome to automatically translate into her native language. And she surfs the web, and anything that's text as image just doesn't translate.
Right.
And so major win going
so
forward.
Accessibility, not a good story.
Yes.
Right. And then the last one that I'll show here is, I have my inspector open here, and I'll switch to the network tab, so I'll just reload this page. And this page is about 181 kilobytes, as Chrome tells us. And if I go into the images part, we can see that 171, which is like 95% of this page, is actually all images, right? And if we look at some of the assets in here, for example, this title here, 11 kilobytes, and there's a whole bunch of these titles. So most of the weight of this page is actually in images that contains text, right? Which is probably not a very efficient way to encode text to begin with.
Absolutely. I mean, you might think they're small, but clearly they add up.
Yep.
And here we were only looking at one page. So if you imagine browsing through a website, going deeper in, the images just add up.
Right. So instead of, I could have maybe downloaded a 20 kilobyte font, and that just would have been reused across all of the pages.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so...
And there's also another use case. So for example, you've listed here the first one, selecting, copying, and pasting text.
Yep.
Where with images, that's lost as well.
That's true, yeah. So right, yeah. So if I'm trying to share something on Google Plus or Twitter or Facebook, I can't just copy the title and paste it in, right? I would have to drag over an image, which is a nightmare.
Absolutely.
or more likely I would have to remember what it is and retype it, which is not good, not a good experience. So with that out of the way, I think this is a good time to pause and talk a little bit about the history, like what happened between 1997 and today, right? It's a long time.
Okay, great, yeah. And I love this diagram. It really shows that between 2009 and mid-2010, it seemed like all the planets aligned, and web fonts really did become an option for everyone. And it was sort of a few things. So it was a combination of all of the major browsers adding support for web fonts. You have Safari, Firefox, Opera, Chrome.
Yep.
In addition, it was the development of an open source tool, TTF to EOT, that allowed your average website developer to create EOT files such that they could support EOT. Before that, there just weren't any really easy to use tools, and so it was very cumbersome to support IE. And then in the same time frame, all of the web font services popped up. And so we went in the course of just roughly over a year from basically web fonts
It
not
looks like
being
zero.
supported. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, practically zero to close to 100%. So very, very exciting.
Right. And I think today most every browser supports web fonts. I think there's some outliers. I think last time I checked, Opera Mini still did not support some of the formats.
That's right.
Right, but basically every other platform is already there. And I think that leads into a good point, which is there are many different file formats, which is something I didn't really appreciate. I was aware of it, but I didn't understand the difference between them. So can you tell us a little bit about this?
Sure. And one thing that I like is how you've highlighted under each different font file format the percent of web browsers that each one supports. And the first takeaway is that none of the font file formats are supported by 100% of the browsers. So if you're self-hosting today, you pretty much need to serve all of these font file formats in order to support, close to 100% of the browsers today.
So this goes back to how hard could it be? I would just throw up a file on my server and I'm good to go.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there's a lot of complexity under the scenes. The web is moving forward. Things are getting better. Browsers are evolving. Down the road, maybe we only will need one font file format, but we're not there yet today.
Right.
And so that has been one of the goals of the web font services, Paul Irish with the bulletproof @font face syntax, to get to the point where, we could just hide all the complexity.
Right. So when I was pasting that CSS style sheet into my page, my demo page, I didn't have to worry about any of the stuff, which is great. Right. So I assume that you guys are taking care of figuring out the font formats and all the rest.
That's right. So if you use a web font service, all of the complexity is hidden. It looks really simple, easy to use. If you are self-hosting, it is more involved, and you do need to stay on top of it.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. So,
great. So, jumping ahead, one thing that we wanted to talk about today is basically what are some of the interesting architecture decisions and optimizations that Google Web Fonts has made.
Right.
They only make sense, however, if we sort of step back and look at them all in context. And so here are some observations that we've had, and especially looking ahead.
Right.
In a nutshell, the web is the new platform. It's growing exponentially. More users are coming online. The number of web fonts is rapidly exploding. For the web-safe font formats, the number of web-safe fonts is just so history. Online content is becoming so much richer to the point where it's beginning to mirror offline content. And if you think of offline content, where newspapers, magazine, books, they're all so rich. To date on the web, they've all been very lacking. And we think that that's been holding people back from moving to the web.
And I certainly think there are good examples where we've already gone way beyond that, right? Where we're getting much richer experiences on the web while not sacrificing the look and feel and the beautiful kind of experience that you get out of it.
Yes, absolutely. And so we see it all snowballing as the content becomes richer, more people will be drawn to the web, etc. Another interesting observation is the number of devices per user is growing. So for example, I have 5 devices. I have a phone, a tablet, laptop, desktop, and a Google TV.
Yep.
And all of these devices have a web browser that I use to browse the web, and
Yep.
increasingly a lot of the sites that I'm viewing
Yep.
use web fonts.
And as you mentioned, some of these devices only have one font on their system, right?
Yeah, exactly. And
web
so
fonts is really the only option there.
Right. I mean, the web just doesn't look that great if you're only looking at it through one
Right,
font.
in a console font, right?
Yeah, could you
Yeah.
imagine if it was Comic
Yeah.
Sans?
So in 2 to 10 years, yeah.
Yeah, so these are some predictions. Take them with a grain of salt, but I really seriously do think that within this time frame, we could see 1 trillion web pages using web fonts. We could see 1 billion active users on the web viewing these sites, 1 million websites using web fonts. We could see larger font files, largely as the fonts are, grow to support more languages.
Right.
And we could see an explosion of fonts, maybe in the 100,000 range. And then pages will become richer, more typefaces will be used, more styles weights.
Yep.
The number of devices is exploding.
So this sounds really exciting, but this also scares me from a performance point of view. Right? It's like, okay, so if I'm downloading 2 to 4 typefaces, one megabyte each, man, that's going to be not a good performance story.
That's absolutely correct. And in addition to that, bandwidth does cost money. Hopefully, in time, the cost goes down. But say it was 10 cents a gigabyte.
Right.
Your manager would come and knock on your door as well.
So thankfully, I think we have some techniques to address these issues, right?
That's right. But in a nutshell, we at Google, we really like large problems, and we see this as one of them.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it's an excellent opportunity for us to help, move the web forward and make it faster.
Yep. That makes sense.
So some goals that we had for Google Web Fonts. Basically, we wanted to have a really simple, intuitive, and easy-to-use API to really help accelerate the adoption of web fonts and to get it to the point where people were very willing to just try them.
Yeah.
We wanted to make sure that our architecture would scale to the opportunity, and as we've talked about, we think it's huge.
Yeah.
And then this may be counterintuitive, but we also wanted to see if we could basically come up with an approach that would become increasingly faster as the number of integrations grew.
Yeah, this is very important because it's not something I appreciated until we kind of went through this in detail, right? Google Web Fonts should get faster the more they get used.
That's our goal,
Right.
and we think we're seeing early data.
Yeah. Okay, so
And continuing this, we wanted to make sure that we could enable transparent and ongoing optimizations. So as the web font technology improved, better compression algorithms, better way of subsetting fonts,
yep.
we could roll out these improvements transparent to all of our users, and they would just seamlessly benefit.
Right.
And then, as we've been talking about throughout the session, there's a lot of complexity. We wanted to hide all of that.
Yeah. So let's dive into some of the complexity, right? I think we've spent a lot of time talking about why this matters. Now I'm convinced. Let's take a look at, so what's the problem that we're trying to solve?
Great. So this is basically the biggest optimization. One thing that we realized is fonts are one of the most reusable resources on the web.
Right.
And what we're seeing is that many websites are using the same font. So for example, here you could imagine there's N websites. They're all self-hosting open sans.
Yeah.
And so when we as users go and browse all these sites, what's happening behind the scenes is the browser's downloading open sans,
Right.
the exact same font bytes over and over again.
Right.
And as you can imagine, the end result is not a great experience.
Especially on, let's say, mobile platforms where the amount of available cache space is also not very large, right? So if I'm downloading one of these, let's say 500 kilobyte fonts, and I visit 10 sites and they're all using the same font, I have 5 megs worth of font data.
Yes, or you're constantly evicting, the exact same
Right.
font just to
Right.
re-download it over again.
Yeah.
And so the observation that we made was basically we wanted to enable cross-site caching of web fonts.
Mm-hmm.
So for these N websites, if you'd imagine, they're all using Google Web Fonts. They're all using the same API to import Open Sans.
Mm-hmm.
What the end result is for end users is when they visit the first website, they would download Open Sans. But from then on, when visiting the next website, they would just pick up Open Sans from the browser cache.
Sure.
And so basically, there wouldn't be any latency hit in visiting all of the other websites. And the net result here, it's very different. I mean, we see lower latency across the board. It's sort of amortized across all websites. And bandwidth drops, in particular for the web font, for the website, as we're serving the font. And as we're mentioning, with this approach, as the number of integrations increases,
right,
it could become faster for everyone.
Right. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So I think it's also important to just call out one quick thing here, which is there are many different ways how to serve web fonts, right? And I think some of the other providers may have a different model. So for example, it also depends on your business model, right? So for example, I know that the early implementations of some of the platforms, I'm not sure what they're doing now, actually wanted to make sure that they serve a specific font per site, because that's how they would bill you or charge you, or even know how many fonts they've served, because maybe you get charged by page use. So in that case, you would download the same font every single time, but that was kind of a business reason to do that, right? Whereas here we're saying the more people use Open Sans, the better. And that Open Sans is the same URL across all of the sites. So if CNN.com uses Open Sans and somebody then comes to my site using that, I don't have to download that resource, which is awesome.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so here are some early numbers which show this in action. So here's a graph of the top 250 font families. And for each, we're seeing the number of integrations. And so the high-level takeaway is that the most popular fonts are very, very popular and widely used.
So there's a reason why we keep using Open Sans as an example, right? Because it's actually being used on over 1 million domains.
There is. And that's just so exciting. I mean, if you step back and think about it, you as a web user, you could potentially browse 1 million websites and only download Open Sans once.
Yes, that's right. And you still have the beautiful, rich experience of using that web font.
Yes, and then after that, it does drop off, but we still see, the top 40 fonts, for example, are used on over 100,000 domains.
Right.
The top 300 are used on over 10,000 domains.
Right.
And these numbers will only grow. Over the past year and a half, we grew 10x, and it's very likely that that could happen going forward as well.
Yeah, so that's a great point. And then I think we covered this a little bit, but fonts can be quite large. So this number shocked me when you first shared it, which is Arial Unicode for all languages is 22 megabytes.
Yes,
it's massive.
Yes, and the reason being that it supports nearly every language. But as the language coverage expands, font files will grow in size. And to the point where they're going to be getting closer to Arial Unicode.
Right.
And so one thing that we wanted to talk about on this slide is the smaller you can serve fonts, the faster it will be. And so there's a few different approaches that we've taken, and I'll walk you through them. So the first thing we did, and let's start with Open Sans, which is one of the larger fonts that we serve.
So that entire thing would be 217 kilobytes
That's
if I download
correct.
The whole set.
Yes, uncompressed.
Yep.
And currently it supports well over 20 languages. The first thing that we did is we took the font and we created static subsets, one subset per script. And so if you're creating a site in North America, you just use the default script or subset, which is Latin.
Right.
However, if you're creating a Russian web page, you'd want the Cyrillic subset.
Right.
Now, for convenience, all of our language subsets include Latin, and we'll come back and talk about that later, how we could optimize that further. But in just subsetting per script, we reduced the file size significantly. So we dropped from 217K to on the order of 36K for Latin.
So that was that toggle when we were demoing the Google Web Fonts interface, right? When you could select the different languages, or I guess different subsets.
Yes.
That's effectively what I'm picking.
Exactly.
I'm declaring which languages I will use on my site.
Exactly. Yeah. But we didn't stop there. So there are a few other optimizations that we've made. One thing that we realized is for many platforms, the platform doesn't need hints. Hints are additional instructions in the font to help improve the rendering, in particular on Windows platforms. As Mac and mobile do not need them, we've been able to completely strip the hints from those fonts, thereby reducing the file sizes even smaller.
So that's interesting, because that implies to me that the font being served to a Windows machine as opposed to, let's say, an iPhone are actually different files?
That is correct. And I'll show you how we do that on the next slide.
Okay.
But basically, we try and serve the most optimized font file that we can.
For the platform.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Exactly. So going further, after stripping hints, we apply compression. And so with just simple gzip compression, we're able to reduce the font file size by another 50%. And then we can do even better by applying MTX compression for EOT, which reduces the file size by another 50%.
So this is right. So this is on top of the gzip data.
Yes. And going forward, there's a new compression format that we're looking for to WAF2, where we're seeing even further improvements, like another 30%.
Right. So it sounds like this is a very active area of, I guess, improvements, right?
Yes, yes. And we'll talk more about WAF2 later, but it's sort of a cross-industry collaboration. It's very exciting. And then also to just sort of continue this, you can actually go further. So if on your site you're just rendering, I mean, you want to see the font, just for a few characters.
Right.
Like
so
your
let's
title,
say the title.
Or navigation elements. Using the text equals parameter, you can specify those characters. And what we'll do behind the scenes is we'll dynamically subset the font. And so, for example, for ABC and Open Sans, you're looking at a file size in the 3K range.
So if I was to use this and apply it to, let's say, Open Sans, instead of downloading the 217K, and let's say I'm coming on a Mac, right? So I would get a font that is hint stripped, right? So it's already smaller than, let's say, the Windows version. It would be gzipped and compressed, obviously, but then you would also generate a dynamic font for just my title, with maybe like 10 characters that are needed. So likely it's going to be a very small file.
Correct. And it would remain small even as Open Sans continues to grow in size.
Right. So that's a lot of toggles that I have on my site, right, to tweak the performance.
Yeah, and so one takeaway is our average font file size that we serve is 35K. And so they are very small in comparison to the original file size.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So here's how we actually do it. So if you look at the Google Web Fonts API, for example, for Lobster.
Right, so this is the import rule that you guys give on that page that I can copy.
That is correct, yeah. So you copy and paste that URL into your site. Then when someone visits your site, the browser would request that. And in response, what we do is we dynamically generate the most optimal web font CSS for your user agent. And so here, for example, this is the web font CSS for Chrome on Mac. And what you can see is in the web font CSS, there's sort of a pointer to the font file.
Right.
And here, this pointer, it's mapping to Open Sans, regular, WAF, with hint stripped.
Right.
And that's what we serve for Mac. If you're on Windows, it would include hints. It would be a little bit bigger.
Right.
But so here, what you're seeing is really like the power of the API. It's very simple. It's very intuitive.
Yeah, I was never aware of this, right? I just put an include rule, and all of the stuff happens under the hood, so I don't need to worry about this.
Right.
And then I guess 30 variations per font file. So if I wanted to serve this myself, I would have to have a directory of 30 files, and then somehow figure out which one to serve.
Yes. And basically, we wanted to push the envelope of what's possible. So currently it's 30 variations, but going forward it's going to be more.
Right.
So even more with WAF2.
Wow, jeez. Okay, so this starts to get complicated under the hood.
But under the hood, but remember it's all,
Right. That makes sense.
So this is sort of a simplified architecture diagram. It might look complex, but the key takeaways are we have two paths. There's a dynamic serving path, a static serving path. That also gives us a lot of flexibility. So for example, we do support older versions of iOS for which they expect the fonts to be served in SVG format.
Interesting.
We don't get that many requests. It's on the order of 500,000 per day.
Right.
And
Just 500,000.
Yeah, just 500,000. It's all relative. But basically, those requests come in through our dynamic path. We generate the SVG font and send it back. So we have a lot of flexibility on the serving side. But the main takeaway is basically we heavily leverage the Google infrastructure and the Google CDN. And the two are amazing. So for example, the Google CDN, we're seeing our font served from well over 100 cells and satellites. And
so it's 100 locations around the world
where
these files are being served from.
Exactly. And so what's really exciting for the typical web developer is odds are the font's being served much closer to the end user than the website itself.
Right, so which helps you with the latency and a faster download, all of those things come together, which will hopefully lead to a much better and faster browsing experience.
Absolutely. And then the fonts that we serve are heavily cached, so both the server, inside Google and then caching proxies and whatnot.
Right.
And the end goal is basically you would be downloading fonts from down the street, like your ISP or your telco or whatnot.
Right. Yeah, that's an excellent point. So let me see if I can put all of this together.
Okay,
right?
great.
So
we went through quite a bit.
Yeah, so I'll come back to the actual font that we used originally, right, which is this Scrangy font. So not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but I got my link tag, right, and I put it on my page.
Yes.
So when the browser comes and requests this CSS file, this is what I'm going to see in this file. And in this case, it's actually downloading a WAF file. And because when I was doing this, I was doing on a Mac, I guess the API figured out, based on my user agent, that WAF is the most optimal format, and it's going to serve it from the Google CDN, right? And then kind of one other optimization that there is in here, which is, it says, if you have it locally installed, and you can locally install these fonts, then use that. Otherwise, there's a fallback, use this WAF file and download it from the Google CDN.
Correct.
Right? So that's the reason why we don't see the EOT files and other, because this file by itself is a dynamic file being served for my platform, right?
The CSS is dynamic, correct.
Okay, perfect. So, and then I look at the headers of this request, and it actually tells me a couple of interesting things. First is this request, whoops, we went back there, has cache control private, which means that this resource is customized to this host, right? And it should not be cached in some intermediate proxy, because if I then connect through the same proxy on my mobile phone, that may be the wrong file to download to begin with, right?
Correct. And so specifically, this is for the CSS.
Right. So yeah, exactly. This is just for the CSS file. But nonetheless, you tell me to cache this file, this dynamic CSS file, for a day. Now, why for a day?
Yeah. Well, basically, as I mentioned earlier, we're rolling out continuous improvements and optimizations.
Right.
In addition, we continue to improve the fonts themselves. And so we want to make sure that as the fonts improve, as they get smaller, you pick them up as fast as we're able to roll them out.
Okay.
So with this approach, when we roll out a better font, users pick it up within a day.
Within 24 hours, right? And then I noticed that when I download the actual font file itself, that file is cached for a year.
Yes.
Right? So if I come to, let's say, CNN, and CNN is using this font, it'll be in my cache for a very long time, unless it gets evicted. And the more sites use it, the less likely it gets to be evicted, because it's usually least recently used cache.
Exactly.
Right? So that gives you a lot of optimization. So, which leads me to kind of a couple of different scenarios. So a lot of people ask me questions about, well, why does Google Web Fonts request a CSS file and then does another request? And that's the reason, right? We're betting on the fact that the more people use web fonts, the more likely that font is to be in your cache. And it's even better to have it in your cache and not make that request than to serve it in line in that CSS file.
Correct.
Right. So a couple of different scenarios to work through here. First one is you're coming to a site. Let's assume you have an empty cache and you've never been to the site, right? So what's going to happen is you'll request the optimized CSS file, or you'll request a CSS file which will be returned optimized to your platform, and then you'll go out and download the font. So that is your most expensive case, right? So 2+ requests, and plus because if you're using multiple fonts, it'll make multiple requests. On the next page view, right, we know that the CSS file will be cached for a day, so that doesn't have to make a request, and the font file is cached for a year. So on my next page view, 0 requests, which is nice, right? And I still get the nice experience. And then let's say 24 hours later, I come back to the site. I may have to refresh that CSS file. And if the underlying font has not changed, then that's all I need to do, because that's still likely in my cache, right? But even there, the 24 hours, I put a couple of stars in there because let's say I'm using Open Sans. Chances are I visited some other site in between those 24 hours where I was forced to do that refresh.
Exactly. One of the other 1 million websites.
Exactly. So the most frequent case is actually likely to be 0 requests.
That's our goal.
Right. And I think this is important because when you are, let's say, in your developer tools and you're just hitting refresh, and oftentimes you're forcing a hard refresh on your page, right? Which means to clear the cache or don't consider the cache and just re-download all the resources, you're seeing that performance hit of re-downloading the fonts all the time, right? And I think a lot of people get scared of that because, well, as they should be, right? Because you're downloading these external resources. But they're forgetting that the whole premise of the service is built on the fact that there's a CDN behind it, and we're trying to reuse the cache.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as the number of adoptions, integrations increases, it should all just get faster.
So there's definitely a cost, but we're doing a lot of things to make sure that that cost is minimized.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So this is, I think we just covered this, but I had this question from Eric, which I think is very important, so I'll just read it out. So I've noticed that Google Web Fonts link tag or the import fetches the CSS file with the font face declaration, which is true as we saw, which then makes another round trip to get the font file. Is there any reason I should not just include the font face myself? And the answer to this is you could, right? But we're doing a lot of stuff under the hood to pick the right file type and optimize for the cache on your machine. So.
Correct. And then also, in addition, as we roll out new versions of the font, we come back and clean up older versions. And so if you do copy and paste the direct link to the font, eventually your site will break.
Right.
And so we really do encourage people to use the API. And remember, everyone wins when you do that.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. So, that's a lot of stuff that's going on now. What about what's coming in the future?
Yeah, and as I mentioned, it's such an exciting time. It's such an exciting space. And so there's continuous improvement. One thing that we're all looking forward to is WAF 2, which is a new advanced web font compression format. Mm-hmm. It started as a collaboration between Google and Monotype, where Monotype open sourced their MTX compression algorithms, and WAF 2 took all of the best ideas and just builds on them. And so it pushes the limits of web font compression,
right,
where we're seeing 30% smaller font files over gzip with WAF 2.
Right.
All the way up to 50% smaller font files for CJK, the Korean, Chinese, Japanese font files, which is, it's very exciting. Where we're at today is it's under consideration by the W3C Web Fonts Working Group.
Yep.
And we would really encourage everyone to help support it, help
so if you had
the adoption.
To kind of gaze into a crystal ball, would you say this is a year, a 2-year, a 10-year endeavor?
Well, standards do take time. We are hoping to begin serving WAF 2 on our early access page soon, within a month or so.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Right. Yeah, I mean, all of us, we want to see these new technologies rolled out as fast as possible.
Sure.
They do take time to bake, but we're really looking forward to this one.
Yeah, cool.
Another thing that we're going to explore going forward is the @FontFace Unicode range. Here, as we mentioned earlier when we were talking about the language subsets, for all our subsets we include Latin just to make it simple for the integrations. But going forward with Unicode range, we could actually break the subsets up. So we could have just Latin, just Cyrillic, and with Unicode range, the browser could intelligently figure out which one to download.
Oh, interesting.
And This would allow us to make internationalization support more transparent.
Right. So what that tells me is I wouldn't necessarily have to declare this upfront when I'm customizing the font. Right. The browser could actually look at the content of the page and say, "Hey, this looks like Korean content, and that's the font I'm going to download."
That's right. That's right. Yeah. The integrator would say, I just want to use Open Sans.
Right.
Make everything happen for me.
So basically, it just means less work for me, the developer.
Yes, and then it gives us more room for optimizations. We can create smaller subsets.
Right.
There's a lot of things that we can do behind the scenes.
Very cool. And that's independent, obviously, of WAF 2. And what's the state of this work?
Well, at the moment, not all browsers support Unicode range, and so that's one thing that it's been holding us back to date.
Sure.
But maybe we'll explore it later this year, maybe early next year.
Sure. Interesting. Very cool. Okay, so we covered a lot of stuff. So I just wanted to have a couple of slides just to recap and talk about what we've covered. So I think it's obvious, at least it became obvious to me as we were going through this, that using web fonts has a ton of advantages, right? So anything from smaller file sizes to being retina-friendly, zoom-friendly, search, accessibility. There's so many benefits to using web fonts in general, right? So which is part of performance, right? Because you get better engagement, better user retention, and other things. And the other thing that I think a lot of people don't realize is combining CSS3, as we saw with this Flatland example, you can create some pretty fantastic things, right? Which I did not expect. And then the other tip is, we didn't show it in the original demo, but all of the fonts on Google Web Fonts are open source, which means that I can actually download them onto my local machine, or all 531 of them, and either use them in my design workflow or in my text editor, and in any other way, for that matter, right?
Correct.
So in fact, if I downloaded all the fonts, I wouldn't have to download those fonts from the Google CDN.
That is correct, and that's via the local hint that we use in the dynamically generated web font CSS. One note, however, if you do that, please make sure you keep them up to date,
right?
Such that you benefit from all the hinting improvements and whatnot.
Yeah, I'd love to see a font manager that can just do that automatically for me on my machine.
Yes, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, but I don't think a lot of people realize that you can actually download them and use them locally, which is quite nice. Then we also, I guess, talked about the different font formats, right? So EOT, WAF, SVG, and others. And Google Web Fonts manages all of those variations based on the platform. And it sounds like, iOS 5 versus iOS earlier version may even have different kind of preferences for which fonts to use. So all of that is hidden away from you, which is quite nice.
That is correct.
So nothing stops you from hosting your own fonts. Right, and I think in some cases a lot of people have been recommending that, but now that we've gone through all of this, I'm personally on the side of like, I'll just let you guys handle all of this, all of this work, because it looks like you're doing a pretty good job. And there are cases where you would want to host it yourself. So, for example, if I have an offline app, right, which I still want to look nice if I'm on a subway or something like that, I could download the font, serve it, as my offline resource. But then make sure that I have some update mechanism, as you mentioned, to make sure that I'm still getting the benefit of the periodic updates that you guys are rolling out, right? So it's not either or, but if you're getting into the I'm going to roll my own solution, make sure you understand the complexities, because if you just grab the WAF file, as you saw, it'll be 78% of the browsers. So some platforms will not work, or they will work. You'll get the page, but it just won't look the same, which is probably not the experience you're looking for.
Exactly, and then you'd want to make sure that you go back and update your page when WAF 2 comes out.
Exactly, right. So just keeping tabs and all of that stuff. So you can do it, but it's your own call. And then the other point is, as you mentioned, these are static assets. They don't change usually all that often. I mean, they do change, but most of the time they're the same. So using a CDN is a very good strategy for accelerating this type of content. And I guess Google Web Fonts leverages the Google CDN, which does a lot of this work under the hood, which is quite nice. We talked about some of this stuff here, but I'll mention a few other things. So in the original workflow that we demoed, we showed, we picked one font, and we picked different versions of the same font. But you could, in fact, speaking of this dynamic capability of serving the CSS file, if you're using multiple different fonts, you can actually still have one CSS file that includes all of those, right?
That is correct.
So to do that in the web interface, you add fonts to a collection, and then you get kind of a customized CSS file. Or you can just use the API and just kind of use this pipe symbol here and say, I'm looking for OpenSense and Lobster, which is another font, right? So that's one optimization. Instead of downloading multiple CSS files, you can just download one, which is nice, right? So that's a good tip. Another one I mentioned earlier, I know I was guilty of this, which is, oh yeah, I want to use the Ubuntu font, right? And yes, I need the bold and the extra bold and the italic and all of these things, right? And I think the font was like 100 kilobytes. And I didn't actually end up using a lot of those things. And some of the browsers are smart enough not to download the weights in the fonts that are not being used on the page, but some are not, right? So if you're including files which are not being used, then you're probably downloading resources which you frankly just don't need.
Right. And that was an excellent catch, Ilya, and it just sort of reinforces that we're far from done. There's constant improvement. And so, for example, WebKit is addressing that now.
Right, yeah. And then last tip you mentioned, there are different subsets to each font. So we have in Consolata here, and you can include different languages. So for example, in this case, we're including Latin and Cyrillic. So this tells me that maybe this is a page that is both in English and Russian, or mixed content, which is nice. You can customize that yourself. And then the last one, which I think not a lot of people know about, is something you mentioned earlier, which is this character subsetting, right? So this is like a custom font just for these characters, just for Hello World, which is great for titles and other things, right?
Yes,
so
yes.
You can handcraft this CSS yourself to be like the exact perfect number of bytes, minimum number of bytes for your page.
Definitely.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. So I think we're already way over time, but let's see if we can take a few questions here. Let me just refresh this page here. Actually, I probably didn't need to refresh the page. Okay, so we have 4 questions. So one from Steve Satters. Are you working with browser vendors to get better font caching, consistent behavior with respect to using default fonts than Flushman styled content, higher priority caching for web fonts, etc.?
So that's a great question, and our biggest advocate actually has been Steve Soeters.
Go Steve.
Go Steve. Yeah, and we're very fortunate. And so Steve's been reaching out to all of the browser vendors like IE and Firefox and Chrome to encourage them to have larger caches and cache resources for a longer amount of time. But it's not just Steve, it's all of us. We all want to move the web forward and really accelerate the adoption of web fonts.
Yeah. So I think one example that we discovered as we were preparing this is we actually found a bug in WebKit, right, where it was downloading font weights that were not being used. So I think we actually have a patch for that, right? So it's not out there yet, but that's an example of work.
Exactly.
That we've done. Okay, so let's take another one here. So we already answered Eric's question. So another question from Steve. Are you working with browser vendors? No, wait, that's the one we already had. Okay, so one from Joey. To maximize browser compatibility, we have to specify many different file types for each font, right? So we saw EOT, WAF, etc. Are browsers smart enough to only download the file that applies to them? If browser understates multiple types, are there a priority order?
So there absolutely is a priority order, and you can list the fonts in the formats that you prefer, and the browser will go through it, will look at the format, and will treat it as a hint. So if it supports WAF, it will download that file and use it.
Right.
There are a few caveats. So all of the modern browsers do the right thing, but some of the older ones don't parse the format tag. And so here we would highly recommend reading up on Paul Irish's bulletproof at font face syntax to make sure you're aware of some of the caveats.
Right, but if I'm handcrafting these files myself, right, I can just specify one URL for the WAF, one URL for the EOT, etc. For Google Web Fonts, when you download that CSS, it'll likely include just one, because you guys are already figuring out the right format for this platform.
That is correct, and there are a few edge cases. So for example, to support Chrome Frame in Internet Explorer,
Right.
we do use a small variation of the bulletproof syntax.
Okay.
So we serve up both the embedded OpenType file and the WAF file.
Right.
But in general, we try and keep it as simple and straightforward as possible.
Right. So as usual, there are a lot of kind of nitty-gritty details and to make every platform work well.
Yes,
Right.
today.
Right.
And it's ongoing. Hopefully, 10 years from now,
Right,
it
getting
won't
better.
be this complex.
Right. Sure. Okay, so we have another one from Daniel. So many developers are changing icons for web fonts or techniques that uses it, like Font Awesome, which we talked about. How you believe it could impact accessibility, screen readers? So I think this is an interesting question. I don't think it's so. I'm not sure if this is the right answer, but I don't think it makes it any worse, right? So if I previously had a home icon .png, and I'm replacing that with usually the way that web fonts work is you'll actually have like a span element, and then in there I'll declare a class and say like this is my home icon or something similar. So technically speaking, that actually gives more information to the crawler, right? I'm not sure that modern crawlers understand these kind of concepts well enough today, but in general, I think the more we can put in text, the better, as opposed to images, because in general, I don't think crawlers or screen readers are very good at interpreting images.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so I think there are a few more questions, but we are running out of time. So what we'll do is we'll follow up online. We'll respond there, and then also please feel free to ping myself or David on Google Plus or an email, and we'll be happy to chat with you. I think that's it for today. Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.